the positive aspects of Israel that as it's seen from the US and US foreign policy. And it seems so important to US foreign policy, but is that only because it is for individual rights? Is it just it's the most like it's the best ally we have because of that only? Or is there something additional as to why it's important to us as a nation, let's say?
So I think there are two parts to that. One is, what is the central character of Israel as a state, as a sort of its legal and political institutions, and what's the standard we judge it by? And then there's the question of its role with respect to America and what makes it an ally. Is it a good ally? So how to judge Israel, basically. And I think the standard there is human life and what human life requires, what we need to prosper. And that, I argue, is we need freedom. We need political and economic freedom. And the more, the better. And the closer you approach that ideal, the better the society that you create. And that, to me, is the basis for evaluating Israel and saying that it's a basically good society, in that there is real political freedom. There is freedom of religion. There's freedom of speech. Whether you're a man or a woman, gay or straight, whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist or a Jew or whatever, or some other minority group, if you're a citizen, you can vote. And if you want to serve in government, you can serve in government. You can be a prime minister if you're a woman. You're not made a second-class citizen as you are in places like Saudi Arabia, where up until a year and a half, 2 years ago, women were not allowed to drive. And it was laughable, but really sad at the same time, because the norm in the Middle East is what we saw in Europe 200 plus years ago, which is there's real subordination of women, or what you might call gender apartheid. They're not full human citizens, they're full human beings and citizens. And gays, well, I mean, to say that they're being dehumanized in the Middle East is, to put it mildly. And if you care about human beings and individuals, you should care about these things, and including religious freedom. Now, I'm not religious, I'm an atheist, but I think of it as the wider category of intellectual freedom. So to believe or not to believe some religion. And if you go next door to some other countries in the region, or Europe several hundred years ago, it was a crime not to believe what was the official doctrine. And in Israel, it doesn't matter what you believe or don't believe. And so there's, in key respects, it is a free society. And you see this in measures of human well-being, such as infant mortality, life expectancy, economic measures, and it really outpaces all of its neighbors, precisely because the extent to which it's free. And it goes a long way to protecting individual rights. That's the standard. Now, I mean, there are problems. It doesn't do it perfectly, and there's things I criticize harshly. And I think the blurring of religion and state in Israel is a real problem that needs to be addressed. But it's basically a free society, just as the United Kingdom is, and it has its problems, but it's basically a free society. So that's the basic way of thinking in terms of to evaluate Israel, and why I think it stands on the right side of this. And then on the issue of what makes it an ally, or what makes it a particularly good ally to the US, I think part of this has to be understood in the wider context of what's happening in the Middle East, and what's been happening for 30, almost 40 years now, which is the region has what's rising as a movement in the region is the jihadist movement, or the Islamist movement. And this is the idea of imposing Islamic rule as a total system on society by force, and kind of conquering lands in the name of Allah. And this is represented by groups like Al-Qaeda, more recently by ISIS or the Islamic State, and by regimes like Saudi Arabia and Iran, and there's many other subgroups and fractions and so on. So this has been a rising movement across the region, and it's been rising within the Palestinian movement too. It's become more jihadist over time. So what I think is essential to understand is that the enemies that Israel faces in its neighborhood, and the ones that it faces among the Palestinians, is basically the jihadist movement. That's the vanguard of the hostility toward it, to the extent that is an ongoing thing. And that's, if we look at the region from the perspective of Washington, if you're sitting there, what is it that we should be concerned about? And I think the jihadist movement is the big story about the Middle East for the last 40 years. We haven't, up until 9/11, people didn't really get that, but the 9/11 was a moment of clarity, or should have been a moment of clarity, to understand, okay, it isn't just that this region is chaotic. There's a certain pattern to what's going on. There's a certain pattern to the ideas animating the certain regimes and movements that are hostile to the US. So in effect, we have the same enemy. So in that respect, we share a common enemy. And then on the other side of it is we have common values and common interests, like being basically free societies that protect the value of the individual and the freedom of the individual. So there's real common ground in terms of positive values and real concerns about shared sort of shared enemies. Their enemies and our enemies they're sort of they're essentially similar in their hostility.